Picking up from where we left off, I wanted to talk a bit more about the story and where it could be headed as well as the characters. There is a lot to get through with this one in particular, including a potential hidden message within the game's logo. Cory confirmed that Lost Planet 3 writers Rich Gobert and Matt Sophos will be writing God of War with him. If Lost Planet 3's story and dialogue were anything to go by, then I'd say that God of War's story is in very good hands. He tweeted all the way back in August 2014 that they had the entire story mapped out on 171 cards, so we know that all of the main story beats were pretty much decided from as early as 2 years ago, and I think it goes to show just how little we got to see at E3. For more clues on what the story might be about, there are actually quite a few hints on the God of War website. You can find it by simply typing in www.godofwar.com. On the second part of the site towards the left, it says the following. His vengeance against the gods of Olympus far behind him, Kratos now lives as a man in the lands of Norse gods and monsters. It is in this harsh, unforgiving world that he must fight to survive and teach his son to do the same. Then if you go to the center, it says that with new purpose and his son at his side, Kratos must fight for survival as powerful forces threaten to disrupt the new life that he has created. So this essentially confirms two things. The first is that the Norse gods are definitely out there. The second is that the trouble is coming to Kratos instead this time around, since it looks like he would rather live a life of solitude, and that this is the reason why Kratos has to go on some sort of journey. It further confirms that the demo took place in Midgard. Set within the untamed forests, mountains and realms of Norse lore, God of War features a distinctly new setting with its own pantheon of creatures, monsters and gods. If you have seen my previous videos, you'll know exactly what they mean when they refer to monsters, gods and realms. Bear McCreary, the composer of the game's soundtrack, wrote on his blog that creative discussions with Cory would prove vital to understanding the world of God of War. The new game is rooted in Norse mythology and as such, introduces many new characters, story arcs and relationships. I took detailed notes trying to map out how many musical themes would be necessary to guide the audience throughout the epic story. He also said that he was brought on to compose the soundtrack at a very early point in the process, which is very good to hear, and that his favourite game in the series is God of War 2. What we can take away from this is that he was already a pretty big fan of the series before he was even brought on to do the project, so the game's soundtrack is in very good hands. I mean, he has already been involved in composing music for big TV shows like Outlander, The Walking Dead and Battlestar Galactica, but the fact that he is already a big fan is the icing on the cake. I personally think that he's done a great job with the soundtrack so far. The main theme sounds fresh, yet it has something about it which makes it feel like it belongs in a God of War game. Before we even saw Kratos at the conference, I had a strong feeling that they were going to open up with a demo for God of War based on that score alone. When Cory was asked about whether a higher quality version of the main theme would be made available, he said he would look into it. He also said that the soundtrack would only feature lyrics from ancient Norse, which makes sense given that Old Norse will be the main language of this new world. Going back to the characters, I think the existence of Odin and Loki are all but confirmed at this point. The troll mentioning Valhalla, the Sleipnir figure, and the fact that the runes have been brought to Midgard can all be traced back to Odin. Meanwhile, Jormungandr, one of Loki's own children, can be spotted at the end of the demo. Sleipnir was also a child of Loki. If Kratos thought Hermes was bad in God of War 3, I cannot wait to see his reaction to someone like Loki, who will be at least 10 times worse. Jormungandr is also proof for the existence of Hel and the beast Fenrir, since they are both his siblings. Based on his size, I think we can assume that we are quite far into the timeline, though in events like Ragnarok would probably still be a long time away. For another reference regarding his size, sailors would sometimes mistake his back for a chain of islands. Giant bosses similar to the ones in the previous games were also confirmed, so we know that we'll fight some of the monsters that I previously mentioned. They will be bigger than the dragon that was shown at the end of the demo, so I think that a dragon that size will be a mid-tier level enemy. I don't think it's Fafnir or Nidhogg. Nidhogg is underneath one of the roots of Yggdrasil in Niflheim, and Fafnir is far too busy guarding a huge pile of gold. You might remember that while dwarves are the masters of craftsmanship in the Norse universe, they were also known to lust after gold and gems, so their services weren't exactly cheap, and some of them were actually pretty greedy. One such dwarf was Fafnir, son of the dwarf king Hreidmar. The story begins when Odin, Loki and Hænir go hunting and kill Ota, one of the sons of Hreidmar, because they mistook him for an otter. They went to Hreidmar to show off the otter's skin, and he was horrified when he saw what they caught. As a result, he held the gods captive until Loki could fill the whole pelt with gold. Loki, being the god of mischief, didn't like that someone had the upper hand on him, so he filled the pelts with cursed gold that he was told would bring about the death of whoever possessed them. Hreidmar then took in the gold and let the other gods go. Fafnir then strangled his father while he was sleeping to take possession of the treasure. He went out into the wilderness and eventually turned into this huge dragon because of the curse that was put on the gold. Fafnir then hoarded all of the treasure into a hideout and stayed there because he was paranoid about other people stealing it. Cory wasn't willing to disclose whether Kratos had already crossed the Norse gods by the time he goes on the hunt with his son. I have a strong feeling that he has, especially if his son is who I think he is. I think the Norse gods also know who Kratos is and where he came from. If they didn't, I don't really see any other reason for powerful forces wanting to disrupt the new life that he's tried to create, especially when the Norse gods were terrified of Ragnarok happening. That doesn't mean he's killed one of them or anything, but I do think they've had some sort of encounter, and that was what led to his son having scars on his face. Though as Cory said, we'll have to wait and see, as I could be wrong. The word hostile was repeated a lot in interviews when describing the world that God of War takes place in, and we can see why. So far, I can't really see anyone that could be on Kratos' side, but we'll have to wait and see how the story unfolds. I mean, you know it's dangerous when not even a cute talking squirrel can be trusted, and this brings me on to Ratatoskr. Ratatoskr is a talking squirrel who has been living on the world tree Yggdrasil since the beginning of time. He is known more formally as a messenger, but what he really does is spread gossip among the gods and the creatures of the Norse universe as he moves up and down the world tree. Even though he enjoyed creating conflict between people, the gods still came to him for news. The way I can see him fitting into the game is as a potential source of information for Kratos. He was described as a stranger in a strange land, so I'm sure that he will take as much information as he can get about the way that things work. The problem with Ratatoskr is that he can't be trusted and might leak Kratos' whereabouts or where he plans on going to the gods or whoever the powerful forces are that are out to get him. Speaking of conflicts and gods, I find it a bit interesting that Cory doesn't mention Folkvanger when talking about what happens when you die in Norse mythology. He only brings up Helheim and Valhalla. Folkvanger is described as a meadow or a field that is ruled over by the Vanir goddess Freyja. The less distinguished warriors that weren't picked by the Valkyrie to go to Valhalla would usually end up in Folkvanger, while every other human went to Helheim. This might mean that the Aesir and the Vanir are still at war as opposed to being united, and this is something that Kratos could take advantage of. Or there might be a simpler explanation and they left it out for simplicity's sake, since Folkvanger and Valhalla are quite similar anyway. I wanted the chance to talk a bit more about my theory that Kratos' son is prophesied to be the bringer of Ragnarok because I found a huge clue on the website that might support it. It says the following: questioning the dark lineage that he has passed on to his son, he hopes to make amends for the shortcomings of his past. I want to break this sentence down into two elements. The first is Kratos questioning the dark lineage that he has passed on to his son and why this reinforces what I've been saying. I feel that the only reason for a fear like this to manifest itself is because of a prophecy, given that his son is still very young. If he was a bit older, let's say in his late teens or a young adult, I would say that maybe some sort of event might have happened where his son exhibited a dark side, but I'm just not seeing that here with his son still being so young. I could be wrong and he might be like the Rainmaker from the movie Looper, but I think that's highly unlikely based on what we have seen so far. Either way, whether I'm right or wrong, I think there is a lot more to his son than meets the eye. Going back to the website, something like this would certainly give a reason for powerful forces like the Norse gods to want to disrupt his new life when he just wants to live peacefully. It could also explain all of the scars on his son's face when there might have been an attempt on his life from a very early age. Then you have what Cory said in an interview. Kratos has had a tumultuous past. He killed his previous family. He found out that he's pretty much going to end up walking the earth forever. He wants a chance to break that cycle, to have a son who could potentially not fear him, not want to kill him, maybe not even be a god. This theory would also tie into Kratos not wanting his son to be the type of god that he was, and teaching his kid how to be the right one is going to be quite the struggle for him when he still has to work on mastering his rage and rediscovering his humanity. When you consider the tragedy of what's happened to Deimos in Ghost of Sparta, it makes a journey like this even more personal for him. He ultimately failed to protect his brother when they found themselves in a very similar predicament, and he won't want to repeat the same mistakes. I like the idea that he is still haunted by visions of his brother, as Kratos might be worried that he'll fail to protect his son in the same way that he failed Deimos. When Mike Snow asked whether we can expect to see any ghosts from the Greek stories haunting Kratos like Deimos, Cory replied by saying that it was an interesting question that he couldn't answer without giving things away. We can't forget that Cory also wrote Ghost of Sparta, which was the game that dealt with the story of Kratos' brother Deimos. It helped to explain why Kratos was so mad at the beginning of God of War 2, though I suspect he feels regret now more than anger over what's happened to his brother. When Cory was asked about whether Kratos would mention any of his family members in God of War like Deimos or Zeus, he responded by saying maybe. I find this interesting because Deimos is the family that he failed to protect, and his dark heritage comes from Zeus. These things neatly tie into what he might be going through with his son. There is also precedent for this sort of thing in Norse mythology when you look at the fate of Loki's children at the hands of Odin because of a prophecy that they would help bring about doom at Ragnarok. Hel was thrown into the underworld, Fenrir was essentially kidnapped and tied up in Asgard, while Jormungandr was thrown into the ocean on Midgard. It was said that while Kratos won't be seeking vengeance, he will run into a lot of people who are. Hel will definitely be one of them, and so was the troll in the demo. His son might also be one of them, which would be rather fitting, because it goes back to Kratos not wanting his son to make the same mistakes that he made and raising him to be a proper god that isn't vengeful. He has seen the dark destructive path that it takes you down, which Hel ends up walking when she teams up with Sur at Ragnarok, and it was what ultimately led to the troll's downfall. Meanwhile, Sur hated the way that Hel was treated for something that was beyond her control. Sur was actually Loki's godfather and helped raise him when he was a child, as his mother Laufey was in Muspelheim when she gave birth to him. This was why Loki was originally a fire deity before he became the god of mischief and trickery. Sur had his own agenda in wanting to cleanse the world with fire, which he eventually succeeded in doing. It is said that he is the first being that ever existed when there was only the darkness of the Ganuga Gap in between Niflheim and Muspelheim. Sur wanted to return the universe that he inadvertently helped create to the dark abyss of the Ganuga Gap, which I explained in my other video. His motives remind me a lot of the engineers from the movie Prometheus. They were responsible for the creation of life on Earth, but were on their way to destroy it years later. I got the impression that they weren't happy with the way humans turned out, and this would definitely be true if Space Jesus existed in that universe. In the end, their systems failed and stopped them from doing so. You might say to me, well Ilias, we don't even know if it's his biological son, so how can some of the things that you are saying be true? How can he carry Kratos' legacy on his shoulders when they aren't even related? This caught me a bit off guard because adoption arrangements were actually quite common in Old Norse society. Having a child raised in another household helped to extend kinship bonds or to form political alliances. An example of this happening was with the Norse god of war Tyr. Since there are contradictory statements in the Eddas about whether his father is Odin or the giant Hymir, it was proposed by a scholar that Tyr was Odin's biological son and Hymir's foster son, meaning that Tyr was raised in Hymir's home as some sort of a peace pact between the Norse gods and the giants. If you wanted to get crazy with it, you could say that Kratos was substituted in for Hymir and that he had to take in this child as a condition of him staying in the lands of Norse myth, since the gods probably know all about what he did in Greece. I can see why people thought that he might have been his foster son when they had quite an impersonal relationship throughout the demo, and it sounds like Kratos has been away for most of his son's life from the opening dialogue. Based on everything that we have seen and read so far, I still think it's his biological son, even though we haven't had an explicit confirmation. You also had that interview on IGN where the writer talked about Kratos having his own flesh and blood beside him. But I think that's something the writer assumed as opposed to it coming directly from Cory's mouth, so we can only speculate for now. I think the more obvious explanation is that something happened very early on that separated him from both his wife and son, which could very well be the same incident that gave his son scars on his face. Kratos finally makes his way back to them after finding out where they are, and the demo takes place shortly after this when his wife disappears. When it was asked what his wife's name was, whether she was alive or dead, and if she was a god, Cory said that all of these questions will eventually be answered in the final game, so the answers to these questions won't be stretched out into other games, and we'll find out sooner rather than later. So while it may seem like Kratos is emotionally detached from his son, I think that is the point since this is what they want to build on. In order to do the things that he did in the previous games, he essentially became a force of nature and lost his humanity along the way, which explains why he has trouble connecting with his own son and vice versa. We already established in my other video that I think Kratos and his son are going on a journey to change his son's destiny by finding a master of Seidr like the goddess Freya. Seidr is of course a form of magic that allows one to not only see the future, but also change someone's fate. So when Kratos tells his son that he is ready for a new beginning at the end of the demo, this might have had a double meaning. It is the studio's way of saying that this is a new beginning for the series, hence why it's just called God of War, but it might have been referring to his son forging his own destiny away from the previous actions of his father. Another important and very interesting thing to note is the return of the Omega sign in the logo, or at least a symbol that looks very similar with the runes of the gods inside it. The Omega symbol is the last letter of the Greek alphabet, which means that it is often used to denote the end of things. The original creator of the series, David Jaffe, had the end of the Greek gods in mind from the very first one, which explains why the symbol was always in the logo. Now you'll notice that the symbol in the logo of this new God of War looks a little bit different. To me it looks like a more circular version of the Odal rune from the Elder Futhark runic alphabet that we see throughout the demo. The Odal rune represents ancestral spiritual power and divine inheritance. Believe it or not, its corresponding letter in the Greek alphabet is the Omega symbol. Its form is said to have derived from the Greek Omega, which is another clue that supports what I've been saying about his son inheriting Kratos' legacy. This also goes against his son not being adopted, and it's kind of crazy how well the pieces fit together to tell the type of story that they want to tell. Heck, even if I am somehow wrong and it is just a more modified version of the Omega symbol, we know that no matter how the story plays out, the next set of games will somehow build up to the end of the Norse gods in one way or another. I want to finally come back to my favourite sentence on the website and address the second element, which is Kratos wanting to make amends for the shortcomings of his past. We have seen some of what happened to the world after his actions in God of War 3, but I want to see the more personal effect that it's had on Kratos. When you think about it, his revenge ultimately didn't do much for him, and it looked like he just felt really empty after the events of God of War 3. He was far too consumed by his own vengeance to think about the ramifications of disrupting the natural order of things. It didn't bring back his family, and now he has no home to go to, with Greece being destroyed as a result of his actions. He is still being haunted by visions of his past, and this kind of suffering goes back to why he wants to ensure that his son doesn't go through the same thing. Who knows, maybe if he had stopped the cycle of destruction by abandoning his quest for vengeance, his son wouldn't even be in this mess. So Kratos also secretly blames himself for what his son is going through. The reason why I'm kind of clinging onto Athena being responsible for his immortality is because Kratos then becomes a near-perfect analogue for Prometheus, which I find to be quite fascinating. Prometheus foreshadowed the fact that overreaching in efforts to improve human life could bring forth tragedy instead. This could be applied to Kratos' quest for vengeance. You can trace this all the way back to the moment when he sold his soul to Ares in exchange for more power, and how that moment would eventually take him to the end of God of War 3. Kratos gave the fire and power of hope to mankind, which belonged to Athena, in the same way Prometheus stole fire from Zeus and gave it to the mortals. Both are suffering in perdition for it, except you don't need to tie Kratos down before a hungry eagle to make him suffer with the kind of internal demons that he has to face. Having to live with his past is already enough of a curse, hence why he tried to escape by killing himself. This would explain why Cory has been stressing that the game is definitely not called God of War: A New Beginning, because something like this would definitely be worth exploring. There is just so much that you can do with it. He further elaborated on this in an interview with Cinema Blend, in which he said the following. Kratos tried to kill himself, but he discovered that there is no escape from his life. He has to walk the earth forever, cursed by his past. The first 7 games in the God of War series are about him trying to forget that past, and he always blamed somebody else for his problems. He has finally taken the initiative here, left his home and settled down in the forest of Scandinavia, where he is trying to build a new family. Then you have these other symbols from Greek mythology that teach us about what happens when you let your ambition get the better of you. The ones that I am talking about are of course Icarus and King Midas, both of whom we encountered in the previous games. Icarus flew too close to the sun and lost his wings despite warnings from Daedalus not to, while King Midas wished for everything he touched to turn into gold, which would later evolve into a curse. Even though they served the series well from a gameplay perspective, I can't help but think that they foreshadowed what would eventually become of Kratos, especially when he actually took Icarus's wings for himself and lost them after God of War 3. It is quite fitting then that Kratos as a character from Greek mythology would become one of them.
I pay the price for my ambition.
When Cory was asked about his influences for God of War, he cited Resident Evil 4, The Last of Us, The Road, Never-Ending Story, Road to Perdition and Tree of Life among other things. A fine list if I do say so myself. The one that stands out to me the most for now is the film Road to Perdition starring Tom Hanks. The reason for this is because you can draw many parallels between that movie and what they are doing right now with God of War. Without getting into the details, the plot of the film essentially asks whether it is possible for fathers to spare their sons from the cost of their sins. A theme which would very much tie into Kratos' past having an adverse effect on his son, whether that be through a prophecy or some other way. In Road to Perdition, the son of a hitman witnesses what his father does for a living, and events transpire that cause both of them to be on the run. We learn that his father's only fear was that his son would end up being just like him, and spoiler alert, he doesn't. This fear comes off of the back of seeing the son of another mob boss go bad just like his own father.
I saw then that my father's only fear was that his son would follow the same road. And that was the last time I ever held a gun.
That's not to say that this will happen and that Kratos' son will also end up choosing a different path, but an ending like this would certainly fit the blueprint that already exists when you look at the difference between the Norse God of War and the Greek God of War. Tyr was more heavily associated with law, justice and honour, which could be the result of the teachings from a now reformed Kratos. One of the advantages of moving away from the Greek era is that the concept of fate works differently in that things are never truly set in stone. So even if it is prophesied that his son follows in his father's footsteps, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what will happen. I think it is far more likely that his son is Tyr, not Ulla, and there could potentially be a big clue in the demo that points to this. If you look at these tattoos on his forearm in isolation, you can actually see the name Tyr written in runes. If you look at the other runes before that and translate what they say from ancient Norse, then you get the word strong arm. His son is clearly right-handed, so it's obvious why he has this particular tattoo on his right arm. Then it looks like the tattoo repeats itself. I find it very curious that his arm lace cuts it off right after the letter R, so that we get something that very nearly says the strong arm of Tyr. Did the developers purposely put this in to tease that this is who his son might be? Let me know in the comments below what you think, because I am of the opinion that it does. There are contradictory accounts in the Eddas about whether Tyr's father was Odin or Hymir, so they could just substitute Kratos in for Hymir, have him be Tyr's father, and no one would bat an eye. Another thing that supports this to me is the symbolism used in the new logo and the game's heads-up display. Ulla has his own rune, separate from the Odal rune that it's encompassed in. Tyr's rune is also somehow missing, and I don't think it's a coincidence that one of the icons in the heads-up display looks exactly like it. I think it's far more likely that Ulla is his own character, since the Odal and the Tiwaz runes are specifically used for Kratos' son. Cory came out recently on Twitter to say that he hasn't decided on the final name for his son yet, and I can kind of see why. He did say that it will be revealed before the game comes out, so we'll find out eventually. If he calls his son Tyr, it might be too on the nose about the kind of god that his son ends up being, which would take away from the struggle that Kratos faces in raising his son properly. Nevertheless, I still think that his son is Tyr, or at least a version of him, especially when the series is called God of War. This tweet is also further proof to me that his son isn't Ulla, as I don't see a reason for him to struggle with deciding on the final name when Ulla is just fine. It doesn't have the same connotations as a name like Tyr does, in that it doesn't tell us about what happens at the end of the road that Kratos is on with his son. Whatever his name is, I'm sure it'll be a Norse one, so I don't think he'll be called Deimos either. I have seen the name Charlie floating around, which sounds really silly, and if we were to have a placeholder name, I would much prefer it to be something like Ragnar, and a name like this could very well end up being his real one. Ragnar was of course the name of a legendary Viking ruler. The games are said to take place before the time of the Vikings, and if Kratos' son becomes a legendary hero, it would explain why this name ends up being attributed to a heroic Viking king. It would also honour his beginnings as the boy who was on his way to bringing about Ragnarok, and it's sure as hell better than Charlie. You'll remember that I talked about a particular scene being recreated with the new engine in my other video, and it was the scene of the night when Kratos killed his family. I'm willing to bet that his son finds out eventually about the kind of person that his father used to be, and when he does, it would be interesting for him to find out through a vision that Loki gives to him. With Loki being the god of mischief, I'm sure he would get a real kick out of it. This would be very similar to the opening of The Last of Us, where you see the outbreak unfold but from Sarah's perspective instead. It harkens back to seeing Kratos from the victim's perspective in the boss fight with Poseidon, but a bigger, more expanded version of that, with his son exploring the village and seeing everyone getting mowed down, including his own half-sister. It's just an idea since something like this was hinted at, but it'll probably play out a lot differently. We would still play as Kratos during the entire game, and this wouldn't take away from that. It would just be a pretty cool storytelling device in my opinion. There was also a neat reference to the Norwegian fairy tale The Three Billy Goats Gruff, which I didn't pick up on until someone brought it up in the comments. The troll was found hiding under a bridge in the same way the troll in the fairy tale was. The goats had to get across the bridge in order to get to a valley with fresh grass for them to eat, in the same way that Kratos and his son had to cross the bridge in order to get to the deer that they were hunting. The moral of the fairy tale doesn't really align with what was going on in the demo, but I thought it was a nice homage to that story nonetheless. So that about rounds up everything story related that I wanted to discuss. The next parts will address the combat, the PS4 Pro version, and I'll be speculating some more on the release date and what the overall length of the game might be. I hope you guys have enjoyed the video so far, and I'll see you all in the next one.